Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. We talk a lot on this show about the benefits of free and open markets, and given the growing hostility to economic freedom, not just from the Trump administration, but from populist governments around the world, we'll continue to do so. Today, I wanted to approach that conversation a little differently from usual, though. Most of the time, when people say markets are good, what they mean is that markets make us richer, drive innovation, and so on. But markets do more than that. They make us better people, too. This is a controversial claim because so many criticisms of markets will admit that they create wealth, but then chastise them for promoting selfishness and greed, or replacing cooperation with callous competition. That's wrong, however. And to discuss why, and why markets aren't just economically bettering, but morally bettering as well, I brought back my good friend Tom Palmer. He is Executive Vice President for International Programs at the Atlas Network, where he holds the George M. Yeager Chair for Advancing Liberty, and he's a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. If you enjoy Reimagining Liberty, I encourage you to check out my companion newsletter, where I write about the kinds of ideas we discuss on this show. You can find it on my website at www.aaronrosspowell.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Tom. You and I have both spent a significant portion of each of our careers arguing for the benefits of markets, as have many of our friends and colleagues and former colleagues and so on. And a lot of the time when we talk, we being people like us, talk about the benefits of markets, it is in a strictly economic sense. It is that markets create wealth, they create innovation, they allow people to thrive and earn a living, which are all really important features of markets. But I thought it would be interesting to bring you on to talk about the case for markets from a different direction, and that is what we might call the moral or ethical direction, because I think this is an underappreciated aspect of markets, that it's not just that they make us wealthier, but, and tell me if I'm right about this, markets make us better too.
I think so. When you look at treatments of moral foundations of markets or morality in markets, almost all of the attention, almost all, has been focused on the moral justification of exchange. So I think about not only John Locke and so on, but Robert Nozick in Anarchy State Utopia makes a case that you can have justice-preserving transformations. That's what voluntary exchange does. And so therefore, these exchanges are justified. But very little attention paid to moral virtue or whether we become better or worse people on the part of people who defend markets. And it's been very common for people to argue that markets corrupt people, they make us selfish, that they demoralize us. At best, that markets are amoral, non-moral, neither plus or minus, but more commonly that they actually have a corrosive effect on human morality. And I think the evidence is that argument, Michael Sandel has made this case in his book on what money can't buy, the moral limits of markets. He argues that markets corrupt us, and I think it's just wrong. It shows a fantasy view of life in non-market societies. That one of the most obvious is the romanticization of subsistence life in peasant or poor farm communities. The fantasy is that everyone loves each other and there must not be any conflict. In fact, these are full of conflict and extraordinary examples of human greed and predatory behavior. So they see the modern world largely structured by market relations, in our day-to-day lives as corrupting. And I think it's incorrect. And there are lots of ways in which you can see the moral effects of market, not merely their moral justifications.
When we talk about that position that markets are corrupting, and sort of kind of flesh it out for listeners, there are two ways. Like, if I was going to make the case, if I'm making the case that markets corrupt us, I'm curious which of these more reflects the kind of typical view. So on the one hand, there's an argument that there are certain behaviors, traits of character, values, etc., that we recognize as non-ideal, as detrimental to moral and ethical well-being, as detrimental to relationships and social harmony and whatever it happens to be. Um, and so dishonesty, greediness, a like callousness or cruelty, these kinds of things. And then the argument is that for whatever reason, features of markets essentially inculcate those values. They encourage, they incentivize acting upon those values or developing those values, and that they disincentivize their opposite, that like markets select against compassion or empathy, say. That's one way. The other way, which I guess sometimes to me feels more common, is that markets are a kind of activity. It is buying and selling. It is seeking profit. Um, it is competing with other providers. It's these features of the things like add these all up and it equals markets. That those activities in and of themselves are morally wrong. So it's not that markets make you less compassionate. It's that they make you do activities that good people wouldn't do. Um,
Well, what activities do you have in mind, just to be a bit more specific?
so I think I'll think about this in the context of, I think G.A. Cohen has that little book, Why Not Socialism? And in that he essentially says, like, look, when you go on a camping trip, everybody gets together. Each of them brings the stuff that they've got. They all work together to set up the tents, and then they all share what they have, and that they all do this like in like an open and supportive manner. And the answer is yes. Like, that's what a camping trip looks like with your buddies. Um, and but if we instead said, like, you show up and you say, okay, yeah, I brought this food, Tom, but if you want some of it, I'm not going to share it with you, but instead you need to pay me for it. Or I'm going to be in charge of directing the tents, and I'm going to and you are obligated to obey my authority in this way because I'm your boss, or something like that. That the very act of, like, it's not that me selling you the food is motivated by essentially vicious values, but rather, like, even if I have good reasons for wanting to sell you the food, the very act of like selling you the food in the camping trip versus sharing the food is just like a wrongful approach to the situation. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, and then of course there are some conditions under which the asking for money is inappropriate. Someone does a favor to another friend out of friendship. If the person who receives the favor says, "No, no, I insist on paying you for your time," it would be a kind of a repudiation of the friendship. The person has offered it out of friendship. Of course, it's possible in some contexts that persons can exploit their friends in unpleasant ways, so sometimes it is appropriate to pay. But there's a moral sense there that trying to figure out the right thing. If you said, "Oh, let me get that for you," I said, "No, no, I'm going to pay you for that," I would be somehow repudiating your act of friendship. So clearly, monetary exchanges are inappropriate in lots and lots of um, situations. No rational person would deny that. But the notion that the moral standard that we should aspire to is a camping trip, I do find risible. I mean, it's just laughable. It is the story of Jerry Cohen's life. He was my supervisor at Oxford, very funny and witty man, who spent his entire academic life trying to find justifications for, one, his Marxism he was raised in. He went to Marxist summer camp. That's what he did in Canada. His parents were also communists, as he was. So he was raised in a presumably fun summer camp. I guess even communist summer camp's probably fun. You get to hang out with your friends and make campfires and things. And all of his life was trying to find why the argument why all of society should be like his childhood memories of summer camp. I find this bizarre, not morally serious, to be honest. And it caused him to twist arguments into pretzels, to try and get to find the arguments that would lead to the conclusion he already wanted. As a matter of fact, there are some situations where camping trips are fun because you're sharing things. It is a cooperative activity, and that's part of the fun. But not all of life can be like that. And in particular, life with strangers, people with whom you do not share intimate relationships or friendships as you do with your childhood buddies. And to set that standard to govern those relations would destroy them. We have to understand that strangers need to be able to have relationships of mutual benefit just as intimate acquaintances do. So his moral standard might make a very nice little hunter-gatherer band, but I don't want to live in a hunter-gatherer band. For one thing, I don't want to die at the age of 32 of old age. I'd really like to live to a more advanced age. And I'd like to be able to enjoy the benefit of wider circles of company than a tiny hunter-gatherer band, which would be governed by the kinds of moral standards that Jerry Cohen thought were the peak of morality. There's another element there that has to do with our relationships with strangers. Small groups of people, the intimate group, the family is the most obvious one, but then we could expand it out to perhaps a wider family or our neighbors, the kids we grow up with when we're children. We have some sense of what their needs are, what their desires are, what we can expect from them, and vice versa. So certain kinds of cooperation and conflict may emerge naturally in these groups. But if you want to have some kind of cooperation with strangers, with whom one doesn't have that intimate knowledge of their needs, desires, expectations, and so on, we need to exercise our faculties to think about what they would like. And that's one of the things that markets do. If I'm going to exchange something with you, I have to ask, well, what would this other person want? How would this other person like to be treated? I have to put myself into your shoes. That's actually not the most natural thing that human beings do when it comes to strangers. But to learn how to do that is a precondition of market exchange. That's the whole point of trying to understand demand, put it that way, customer needs. You try to think, if I were that person, what would I want? And that brings about a change in moral consciousness. It's not an accident that the great humanitarian movements for abolition of slavery, for example, emerge in the most commercial societies, most notably Great Britain. Not only that, but movements for the ethical treatment of animals. I've lived in a number of societies and places where they're less economically developed, more rural, and I can tell you that the treatment of animals is often simply horrifying, simply horrifying. People run over animals and don't even think twice about it. They inflict tremendous cruelty on them. It's as societies become wealthier through market exchange, people begin to think, oh, those other creatures, they have feelings. They're like us in an important regard. And so the organizations that attempt to protect animals and to shelter them from cruelty and to encourage more ethical behavior do not emerge in isolated village communities. They don't emerge in pre-quote-unquote capitalist times. There's no evidence of such movements, organized movements. They didn't emerge under socialism. Where do they come about? Societies that generate middle classes and groups of people who begin to empathize with animals. So I think that that feature of human beings is rewarded, it's encouraged by market exchanges, voluntary market exchanges. So that's one of the tremendous benefits. You mentioned competition, which is always presented by its critics, not only Marx, but many others, as cutthroat and so on. All the images of competition involve violence. Dog eat dog. I mean, that's a scary, despicable, shocking image if you think about a dog eating another dog. Um, uh, but in fact, when you think about competition among firms, what are they doing? They're competing in order to cooperate with other people, with their customers. They compete to offer better terms, better quality, lower prices, with their employees to attract employees. Our working conditions are better, our wages are higher, with their suppliers, and so on. So all of that competitive behavior is A, not violent, it's voluntary and peaceful. And B, it is a competition in the service of achieving higher degrees of cooperation with other people. So again, I think that people who characterize market cooperation, those terms, don't understand it. Of course, some kinds of competition are like that. A competition between robber bands, for example, a competition between groups of thugs or gangs of various sorts. Those are violent, and that's also competitive behavior. They're competing for turf or prestige or whatever money that they've stolen from other people. But market exchange is voluntary cooperation, competition, voluntary exchange in the service of cooperation.
You've mentioned that if I want to make money in the market, so I am going to sell a product. Um, One way to think about that is the only way that I can find market success is if I figure out what it is that a sufficient number of people want and then provide it for them at a price they're willing to pay for that, that they're happy enough to pay. And so, yes, I am like seeking out. So there's a degree of kind of other directed understanding that is necessary to succeed in this, because you have to understand your customers and their needs and wants and take them seriously enough to dedicate your economic activity to meeting those. And that's a very positive vision of it. But the critics and the kind of people who think that markets are corrupting, the way that they argue against that is to say that one thing that markets do, or that capitalism does, and they're sometimes used synonymously, sometimes they mean a particular kind of market structure, is essentially manufacture wants that are inauthentic. And one way we might think about this, like to clarify this, is to take an extreme example. I get you hooked on heroin. So now you're addicted to this highly addictive substance that is destructive to you and makes your life worse to be heavily addicted to heroin. And now I sell you heroin, and say, well, this is a positive because I am meeting your wants. But we could argue I played a role in creating that want, and that you would in fact be better off if you didn't have that want, that want is destructive of you. And a similar, like, softer version of the argument gets made in general is like you manufacture a consumerist society, and you convince people that happiness is always found with the next product. The next purchase is the thing that will make you happy. But of course, doesn't. Um, and and so then you want the next thing. And so advertising is telling you, oh, actually, it was this new thing that you need. And it's your old iPhone isn't making you happy anymore. You must buy the new one. And so you're kind of stuffing people onto this like hedonic treadmill, and then meeting those needs. And that story, which I think is not correct, and I am confident you don't believe is correct. But if that story is correct, it positions this kind of meeting wants in a rather less positive light. What is wrong with that critique?
Well, of course, there's a certain amount of it that makes some sense. If someone were to actually trick me into taking a substance that creates intense craving that I want more and more of it, and this is the addictive behavior. If someone were to manipulate me into that, that would be a pretty terrible thing to do. The common myth, of course, is that drug dealers give away drugs for free in order to do that. There's no empirical evidence that this happens, that they're handing out pills at schools to school children and so on. But setting aside that myth, it is true that people become addicted to alcohol, to narcotics, and so on. And it can sometimes short circuit, or that's probably not the right term, but it can diminish their choice-making capacity. And I take that very seriously. I've known friends who have succumbed to alcoholism and lost their lives as a consequence. So it's not something that I brush off, the craving for alcohol as a way to find an escape from the difficulties of normal everyday life is a very real problem for us. And that's why groups like AA and Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, I think, are valuable parts of civil society. The bigger picture, though, that somehow wants are created and generated and injected into us against our will, I think is a misunderstanding. Partly it's a misunderstanding of what it means to grow up, which is in fact to acquire new wants that we didn't know that we would have prior to that time. Small children rarely know that they might acquire the desire to listen to opera or atonal music or any kinds of other sorts of artistic experiences. Most children find various kinds of sophisticated flavors icky. They like sweet things. That's the standard default for small children, and acquiring a taste for things that have combinations of bitterness and sourness is a part of growing up and acquiring new tastes. You can even argue that it's a part of civilization itself. We didn't know that we would want something in future until someone alerted us to its availability or its desirability. So the first point is that this notion that there's this pure soul who only wants natural things or godly things or something like that, and wicked entrepreneurs, innovators, merchants. By the way, behind that is always Jews, is the subtext of these attacks on merchants, going back to Justus Moser and even thousands of years before, is that they made us want those things. They enticed us. Well, acquiring new wants is a part of becoming an adult, and it's a part of civilizational progress. So the general model, I think, is mistaken. I do think that there are serious questions that come up about behavior that affects our brains in such a way that we acquire addictions. We have seen, however, that the attempt to completely ban market exchanges has not turned out very well. Prohibition of alcohol, of course, is the classic one that's been so well documented. Prohibition did not turn out well. The actual experience of drunkenness, which we can measure through proxies such as cases of cirrhosis of the liver, went up, not down. People consumed more concentrated forms of spirits rather than beer and wine. and the murder rate rose and then fell after it was legalized. So the attempt to ban markets in alcohol didn't make the situation better. So that's, I think, also an important element. The question of the hedonic treadmill, I think, is about not understanding more people are capable of regulating their behavior than the intellectuals give them credit for. And yes, there are people who spend their money on status, on fancy cars that they really hard to afford because it sends the signal I'm wealthy and successful, even if I have a relatively low income. I'd rather spend it sending the signal that I'm rich than saving up money and actually being wealthy later in life. To some extent, those are differences in values. So I always buy inexpensive cars, and when I've had a car, I drive it for 10 years. I don't really need to send a signal to people with my car, but other people like to buy fancy cars and they enjoy it. And I'm not going to criticize them. It's their money. They can spend it the way that they want. Um, Overall, I think intellectuals give normal people, all the rest of us, too little credit for being able to regulate our own lives.
I'll just add, I think another way that we can push back on the hedonic treadmill being a feature of markets critique is that if you are, is essentially these people have identified unfortunate features of the human condition, then seen them present in market societies, and so blamed markets for their existence. And that this is a result of a couple of things. One is it's actually pretty hard nowadays to find a truly non-market society because, as you said, even in places where you try to ban them, people have that propensity to truck and barter. Um, and the world before the rise of markets is quite distant. And so there's so we tend, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, we tend to idealize these kind of pre-market primitive societies and not really understand what they look like. Um, and the hedonic treadmill is very much that they'll say like, well, what capitalism does is it creates this situation where people are convinced if I just have this next thing, I'll be happy. If I just have this next thing, I'll be happy. But you can go back to ancient societies long before there was anything like remotely like capitalism and find people complaining about exactly the same thing. And it's not like, it's just that the things you wanted weren't things you went out and bought. It was stuff that you maybe had to steal from someone else, or you had to oppress them in order to get it, or there were other mechanisms to get it. But that claim that basically before the rise of capitalism, people didn't have this kind of endless set of like this desire and this is the thing, and then it doesn't make me happy and I'll go for this thing, is just historically ignorant. Like the ancient past is full of remarking on this exact same phenomena. And I think that's a really common feature in the markets corrupt us, is that people look at a market society, they spot corruption in it. And rather than saying, well, is similar kinds of corruption present in non-market societies, they just say it's the markets that caused it.
Yes, of course, alcohol addiction was unknown in all other societies that had alcohol. The complaints about luxury, this is a good example of that. Those are common in the ancient world and up through frankly, we have them today. But it's usually people complaining about other people's luxury, not about their own. There's something to be said for luxury. Luxury in the ancient world meant you had a bathtub, you could bathe, that you had plenty of food, that things around you didn't smell disgusting and terrible all the time, just frankly, most of the time. And being able to enjoy the lives that people typically live today would be considered unimaginably luxurious, really not that long ago. People smelled bad. Bad breath was so overwhelming that wealthy people would buy little sachets of spices to put under their tongues when speaking because it was so revolting. And the stink of rotting teeth, for example. Uh, in Versailles, the stairwell stank of urine. The reason why that they planted, this is the most luxurious home in the world at the time, the reason that they planted those wonderful orange blossoms outside was to overcome the stench of human feces outside in the fields and in the forest there. The smell was so overwhelming that you created a natural perfume to try and cover it up. Most of us don't experience that anymore. We're pretty clean. We don't really smell that bad. Our teeth don't rot in our mouths and create horrible stenches. This would be considered luxury. We take it for granted now. We are so wealthy. Our lives are so much more luxurious than the lives of the wealthiest people of ages gone past. But every generation you hear complaints about luxury, as well as the kids are lazy and all of the complaints about young people. Every time I'm ever tempted by one of these, oh my God, kids these days, how could they? I ask myself, when I start to think kids are going to the dogs, wait, is there objective evidence that their behavior is worse on average than in the past, or am I just getting older? And generally, I conclude I'm just getting older. And this is part of the human condition. Uh, Similarly, with the attack on other people's luxuries, how dare those people flaunt that wealth and so on? I think that it's an interesting question to delve into why this seems to be rooted in the human mind to a large degree, this complaint about luxuries. Fortunately, not everybody, probably not even a majority, but intellectuals do complain about other people's luxuries and about how young people are going to the dogs. There's one other element, though, that you touched on, which is the alleged selfishness of behavior in market exchanges. And I just recently read a really fun and interesting book by an economist who's done a lot of work in behavioral economics, Robert Sugden. It's called The Community of Advantage, a behavioral economist's defense of the market. It was published a couple of years ago by Oxford University Press. I loved his book that came out in the 1980s, The Economics of Rights, Cooperation, and Welfare, which is a very sophisticated treatment of the emergence of rights, property, and cooperation. This one just blew me away like the first one did. And he points out that the thesis of Homo economicus, people are always selfish in markets, we know, in fact, that's not true. And behavioral economics has demonstrated quite a number of behaviors that are not really compatible with the Homo economicus, utility maximizing being or robot that some neoclassicals have put at the foundation of their economic model. The behavioral economists, or those like Cass Sunstein and so on who've written in that tradition, have developed a welfare economics, nudging and paternalism and so on, in order to overcome the allegedly irrational behavior of actual participants in daily life, of how people behave, by helping them achieve their true preferences. And it turns out, as Sugden, I think, very convincingly argues, they just smuggled Homo economicus back in. That's the true rational agent who exists inside a psychological shell that it has as irrational components that don't let them realize they're interested. This outside person, this godlike creature, the policymaker, is going to help the inner true agent achieve its true purposes. And Sugden, I think, pummels this very effectively. But then he does something further that really opened my mind and uh, I think is quite important. And he looks at the way in which in market exchanges, it's not just always I'm trying to get the most I can and you're trying to get the most I can. And if I can increase my payoff by pushing down your payoff, I'm going to do that. That we often enter exchanges and forms of cooperation with cooperative intent. That is actual mutual benefits. Why the book is called The Community of Advantage. It's advantage to the community. And to put it in terms that most of us would quickly grasp, in a sports team, if the coach or the team captain comes to me and says, Tom, we want to help you set up this shot so Aaron can make the touchdown or the goal, I might say, well, that's not good for me. I might have a chance of making that. True, Aaron would have a bigger chance, but why would I want to give that up just for Aaron? Why would I want to sacrifice? Well, the reason is we're on a team. We want the team to win. That's our goal. So if I say to the coach or the captain, well, what's in it for me? Why should I do that? Everyone would look at me and say, what's wrong with you? Why don't you understand what a team is about? That's a cooperative intent that we have because we want the group as a whole to benefit by winning the goal and getting the trophy and so on. In market exchanges, there are plenty of cases in which the double thank you, in which I say thank you after getting the good and the merchant says thank you after selling it to me, is actually authentic. We're both pleased. We were engaged in an activity for mutual benefit. It's true on that simple exchange. It's just a spot exchange. I want the lowest price, and the merchant would like to get the highest price. We find that price in between the maximum I'm going to pay and the reservation price of the seller. So in that sense, I would like to increase my advantage at the seller's cost by getting a lower price, but we're still engaged in a cooperative venture. I have no intention to cheat the person and leave the person in tears because of having lost out on this exchange. If I can go on for just a moment, I'll tell you an anecdote. Years ago, I was in Guatemala with a very dear friend who just passed away recently, who taught anthropology at the university, Estuardo Zapata. He was a wonderful person, very serious anthropologist, and also entrepreneur, a newspaper columnist, and a typical, very hardworking Guatemalan figure. And he was also Mayan, full-blooded Mayan indigenous person. And one weekend I was in Guatemala, and he said, I was there for 2 weeks, and he said, over the weekend, would you like to come visit my country where I'm from, which is the Mayan highlands? And if you ever get an offer like that, the answer is yes. That sounds awesome. And it really was. We traveled through the highlands and went to Chichicastenango, a beautiful place on the lake, an indigenous community. I got to meet the indigenous mayor along with the official mayor of the town. There are two mayors. And he helped me buy some very beautiful things in the marketplace there. And I turned to him after buying something and I said, Estuardo, I feel kind of bad about this. He said, why? I said, I realized I'd just been bargaining with this merchant and the difference in price was about $1. And that's not very much money to me. But to him, it was serious money. It just makes me feel kind of guilty. And he said, Tom, sit down quickly. You have to sit down. So I sat down. He put his hand on my forehead and he says, you have an infection. I said, what do you mean? He said, a socialist virus has infected your brain. You think we indigenous people sell things to white people at a loss and that we go around selling stuff to foreigners in order to lose money. He said, if an indigenous merchant says yes, the merchant made a profit. And judging by My observations of you, a very, very handsome one at that. And then he said something that was a little fun. He said, if you ever want to really ruin an indigenous merchant's day, if you really had a malevolent intent and wanted him to feel terrible, here's what you do. Say, how much is that? And he says, that's 200 quetzales. Just say, okay, and give him 200 quetzales. For the rest of the day, he's going to be slapping his forehead saying, I could have charged 400 and he would have paid it. He said, that will ruin the merchant's day. But bargaining with him to find a price that he agrees to is not harmful to him. So that was a kind of eye-opening experience for me.
I want to say too on markets and on competition and on your team, the team metaphor, which I think is an important one. One of the ways that we can think about how markets make us better is that they give us space to act upon our noblest impulses. That if you are, and this is one of the ways that the wealth that markets creates makes us better, because if you are subsistence, always on the edge of starvation, always on the edge of extreme deprivation, your kind of moral worldview and priorities become very, very focused on. And this goes to the pets example. You and I this fall were together in Delhi, India. And one of the things that you mentioned as we were being driven around with a mutual friend, the city, was how many pet stores there were. And what you told me was that one of the ways that you can tell that a place is becoming wealthier is when you start seeing pet stores popping up. Because people who are extraordinarily poor, and there is still unquestionably a lot of extraordinary poverty in India and in Delhi, but there's also growing wealth. They just don't have like the moral space to take care of an animal. Like they need to eat that animal, or they can't, they just don't have the space. And so the pets are a luxury, but it's also a luxury of care, like a space for caring for something that is not something you need to care for because it's yourself or a child or whatever else, like voluntary caring. That markets create that space. And I was thinking as you were talking about the team thing that one reason to pass me the shot is it's good for the team. If I have a better chance of making the shot and the team's success, and then you share in that success. But there's another way that we pass success or don't mind someone else's success. And there's a feeling that I think all of us, or I hope all of us, have had, where you see someone else succeed and it brings you delight. Like you feel good for them. And that's a form of feeling good. And it's not a selfish, like I somehow benefit directly from your success, but rather like I genuinely find pleasure in seeing you succeed, in seeing you achieve happiness, in seeing you accomplish what you set out to accomplish. And that's a meaningful thing for me. But that can only really happen in spaces where your success doesn't come at the cost of mine, where it's not zero sum, but it's instead, at the very least, like it's positive sum. It's a world where if you succeed, it didn't hurt me. You weren't harming me to do it. And one of the things that markets do is they give us a lot more opportunities for that kind of thing. So I can have my restaurant and you can have your restaurant down the block, and we can both succeed. We don't have to steal customers from each other, or you can have an accomplishment over here, and it's not because you stole that thing from me, but it's because you created this thing that wasn't there to begin with. And I think that's just that feeling is something worth cultivating. It's good to be able to feel that way, to take delight in the success of others. And I think markets give us an opportunity to do that. That is harder to find when that's not how we relate to each other.
Well, let me add another point, because you said that if we're not stealing customers from each other, that's the word, stealing, let's say enticing customers, uh, even among people who are in a business in direct competition, you will find a lot more friendships than you would think by watching television shows. People who are even in the same trade, who may be competing, they're making glassware or furniture or software or whatever it happens to be that they're producing, and they're in pretty direct competition. It doesn't mean that they hate each other. It doesn't mean that they can't be friends. You get that feeling from watching movies where businessmen are always monsters, or more often than not monsters. Various studies that have been done over the years that show the percentage of uh, horrible serial killers were business executives is quite remarkable. Certainly disproportionate to the population and way disproportionate to the actual percentage of serial killers out there, not many of whom are CEOs of big companies. But business people are so negatively portrayed in art and popular culture. Uh, the fact is that people are often buddies, and indeed, there are kinds of friendship that are commercial friendships. Aristotle talks about that in Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics. He doesn't consider it a very high form of friendship to be engaged in exchange with each other, create a commercial friendship, but it's a form of friendship nonetheless. That's among people who are buyers and sellers. But people who are competing sellers, for example, competing to attract the attention of the same buyers, can also be friends and can be supportive of each other. There's no need, no reason, and no real evidence that there's an animosity that pervades their behavior. And indeed, if you look at institutions such as trade shows, that's a very interesting phenomenon. What are trade shows? Why do people go to these fairs? They've been going on for over 1,000 years. Think of the European big trade fairs. These are almost continuous for a good 1,000 years. You go there and you sell your wares and you see what everyone else is selling. You compete, and now today at the trade fairs, they always have awards, the most improved product, the most gorgeous new design, the best new customer relations program, whatever, because people also like recognition. We like to be recognized by our peers and admired, and indeed to have other people say, wow, that's an awesome job, Aaron, that you did. Your business is doing so very, very well. And it doesn't mean that I have to look at you spitefully, as much popular culture would represent, brooding, angry, full of hatred, and desirous of destroying you somehow, even if it's not to any benefit of myself. So the Merchant of Venice sets a kind of standard. Not only is it full of the anti-Semitism of the day, but in fact, the merchant is so vicious, he's willing to forego huge profits just to hurt somebody else. Well, that's a bit incoherent, because if the commercial motive is to try to make more profits, it turns out that this person motivated by profit is willing to forego massive profits. He could have been paid 3 times as much in the play in order just to inflict harm on another person. Well, it sounds like that's not really a commercial motivation at all. If he actually were motivated by making profits, he wouldn't want to harm the other people. He'd want to earn more money. But somehow the person who's seeking to profit is morphs into a creature who forgoes profits, who undergoes tremendous loss for the purpose of inflicting harm on others. Behind that is a zero-sum view of the world, that every gain comes at the loss of somebody else, but that isn't actually how the world works. And people who think it is are, well, shallow. I don't know what else to say about them. They don't get it. They don't look around themselves and see most of the world isn't like that. Zero-sum games are extremely rare, which the sum of the benefits equals to zero, a negative and a positive. Much more common are negative-sum games. Those are games of predation, theft, corruption in which the harm inflicted on people is far greater than the gain to the beneficiary, often by a huge factor. I'm in Syria right now, and the damage that was done by the al-Assad regime is simply staggering. This is a very impoverished society. They have their palaces. They're now in Moscow with the kleptocrat Putin. But if you were to take all the wealth available that you could get from the al-Assad family, sell it off and distribute it to every Syrian, it'd be a couple dollars per person. It really wouldn't be a staggering sum of money. It wouldn't improve their well-being. The harm that was visited, this was once a rather prosperous country, the harm that was visited on them is not just hundreds, possibly thousands of times greater than the benefit that the cronies and the family received from this predatory behavior. But then there's the other kind of behavior, and in voluntary market societies, unlike Syria up until today, they're positive-sum games. That's when we both say thank you when we engage in an exchange. We both benefited. And those positive-sum games are all around us. And people like Michael Sandel, who's a big critic of the market, somehow they don't see them. They're invisible to them. All they see is corruption.
Thank you for listening to Reimagining Liberty. If you enjoyed today's episode, please send it to a friend, or take a moment to review the show on Apple Podcasts. And check out my free newsletter at www.aaronrosspowell.com.